I'm Bridget Griffin-Foley, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wattamatagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. So I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Russo, the head of the discipline of literature at Macquarie, and she will introduce the co-editor of this book, and also, of course, the head of our department, who we're honoured to have here this afternoon, Associate Professor Hsu-Ming Teo. So over to you, Steph.
Hi, before we get started, we just want to acknowledge you, Bridget, for putting this new book seminar together. We think you are terrific, and we really, really appreciate everything you've done. I mean, you were the first person to bring MCCALL together as a department in putting this seminar together, you and Ty, so we really appreciate what you've done.
Thanks, Hsu-Ming. That's very kind. It really has been a delight to learn more about the research activity in the department, and we look forward to a new series next year where we're also hoping to feature some creative works and productions, as well as traditional book outputs.
Thanks, Bridget. So Hsu-Ming, thanks for joining me here in the actual building. It's very exciting. So I just wanted to read the description for Hsu-Ming's excellent and extremely large volume, the Routledge Research Companion to Popular Romance Fiction. So popular romance fiction constitutes the largest segment of the global book market. Bringing together an international group of scholars, the Routledge Research Companion to Popular Romance Fiction offers a groundbreaking exploration of this global genre and its remarkable readership. In recognition of the diversity of the form, the companion provides a history of the genre, an overview of disciplinary approaches to studying romance fiction, and critical analysis of important subgenres, themes, and topics. It also highlights new and understudied avenues of inquiry for future research in this vibrant and still emerging field. And the first systematic, comprehensive resource on romance fiction, this companion will be invaluable to students and scholars and accessible to romance readers. And I can vouch for that. I've used this volume and teach from this volume quite frequently. So Hsu-Ming, I thought I'd start with why romance? What got you into romance, and why do you think romance is such an important form?
Okay, all right. We should start with that question because romance is the most, I guess it has the biggest, the largest share of the fiction market, but it is also, as everybody knows, the most denigrated of fiction forms, right? So, and as somebody who started off in travel writing and then moved to romance, I think one of the things that interests me about romance is the current wave of scholarship on romance. So the first wave of scholarship on romance came out in the 70s, pretty much beginning with Germaine Greer in The Female Eunuch. And she was looking at romance, as a form of bondage, of patriarchal bondage. And that whole first wave, of feminist scholarship from the 70s to pretty much the end of the 1980s, we're just looking at romance and looking at all the ways in which, it was bad for women. It was going to, brainwash women into patriarchal relations. It was terrible for marriage. At the end of Janice Radway's reading the romance, she's, her main complaint about the romance is that, well, it nurtures women because they've got to do all of this housework and they're not receiving emotional support from their husbands and their children. So that's why they read romance. But ladies, it doesn't bring in the revolution, right? So, and that was pretty much the first wave of scholarship. So the second wave took place in the 90s, and that's when romance writers started writing back and saying, you're generalizing the form. Generally, the first wave of scholars just take a handful of books, read it, they're generally Mills and Boons, and then say, they make all kinds of generalizations about it. And romance writers started writing back in the 90s to say, that's not actually what we're doing. We're playing games with the form. We're doing all kinds of things. We're not reading it the way, like you're reading it straight, but that's not how necessarily readers are approaching the romance. And then in the 90s, they also produced, publication histories as well. The third wave of scholarship, which is the wave that we're in at the moment, and which is encapsulated in this volume, takes romance as, I think, approaches it in a very, very different kind of way. And that is to put romance back in the hands of the writers and the readers, and to ask what they're doing with it. So I think, like, in this new book seminar from the discipline of literature, you've had quite a few different approaches to how we as scholars approach literature. So Steph's seminar, for example, gave a really genealogical historicist account of Anne Boleyn, right? Narratives of Anne Boleyn over 500 years. And then Ryan came and did a very formalist, high literary reading of The Wire. But I think, when I think about romance, what's interesting about romance is the way in which, the literary reading or the formalist reading of the text is the least interesting aspect of romance. Because what scholars recognize the genre is useful for is for telling us, or acting as a way in which ordinary women find a way to intervene into all kinds of debates of the day. So the romance becomes a vehicle for women to write about politics, about economics, about childcare, about labor relations, about post-colonialism, all kinds of things. And I guess the shift of publishing from being controlled by the big 5 publishers and the opening up of the digital space has really put the genre back into the hands of the writers. Right, so the writers are doing all kinds of really, really interesting things with romance now, and in many ways, I guess its denigrated status sometimes works in favor of women getting their messages out as well. So just think about, for example, with the rise of Wattpad as a creative writing, online creative writing venue after September 11, during the War on Terror, all of these British Muslim teenagers, young adult, writers started putting all of these Muslim romances out onto Wattpad. And it was a way of them trying to get their points of views and alternative narratives about being a British Muslim in 21st century Britain into the public arena, right? So they were using the romance genre as a vehicle, right, to make these interventions. So from the point of view of third wave scholars, then what is interesting about the romance is not, the formulaic nature of it. It's the way in which writers, and readers who become writers take the formulaic nature and then, and use it to intervene in all kinds of debates, right? And then, and the other thing that's also really interesting, I think, about approaches or 21st century approaches to the romance genre is the idea of the way the romance, performs what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick calls a reparative reading, right, of all kinds of things, a reparative reading of I guess gender relations in the present, a reparative reading of the past, which is something else that I'm working on, so it's not that, I think it's not that scholars don't approach the genre critically, that they don't still apply, I guess, all the insights of feminism to analyzing the romance, because, you can't have a reparative reading without first acknowledging what Kosofsky-Sedgwick calls the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's just that it doesn't end, with the critique and all of these terrible things that the romance is doing to women, right? And so I think in the hands of 21st century, writers as well as scholars now, the issues are a lot more complicated. Some of the most current issues over the last couple of years actually have been about the intervention of BIPOC writers and readers in the romance genre and the way in which they are critiquing capitalism and the operations of the romance market. The same is taking place as far as debates about gender and sexuality and marginalized sexualities are concerned as well. So I think, for me then as a cultural historian, that is what is interesting about the romance. If you approach it from a literary point of view in terms of a formalist analysis, you're going to get very little, but it's about, a sociological reading and anthropological reading of it that then becomes very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that feeds into my next question, which was going to be about the challenges of being a romance scholar, because I think it's, the fact that this is the first kind of systematic review of romance scholarship is saying something about its kind of cultural positioning. So what do you think some of the challenges of being a romance scholar are? And I was wondering if you could comment on, I think sometimes when talking to students, they perceive romance or genre fictions as too unfairly, I think, flimsy or lightweight or not kind of complex enough to base scholarship upon. How would you respond to that?
Again, it depends on how you approach it, right, and your analytical toolbox. Because if you're going to analyze it, for the language and all of that, it's probably not going to yield much reward. Although, having said that, Eric Murphy-Selinger, who is my co-editor, he does really, really interesting, complex formalist analyses of different kinds of texts as well. But it's, I'd say that, why we put this together was because precisely we kept running into this problem of when graduate students at conferences presented papers about the romance, and they go back to Greer, they go back to Janice Radway. It would be all of the romance is bad for women, and there was this very top-down approach where the scholar knows best. Right, and we as feminist scholars know what women ought to be reading, and we know how they're being brainwashed, and we know all of this kind of stuff. So it was still a very second wave, feminist approach to the genre. And what we wanted to say as scholars is that, we wanted to flatten the hierarchy, right, and to acknowledge that we as scholars don't know the genre better than the fans do, right? We don't, the genre is huge. It's like millions and millions of books put out every year, and there are so many different subgenres as well. It's not possible to generalize across, and quite often the fans know more than the scholars do as well. So we want to work hand in hand with the fans, right, and to acknowledge the work of the fans as well, or the ACA fans, and the para academic community as well that sprung up in terms of blogs and all of that. This genre is interesting to me because I'm interested in in democratization in popular culture, and this is one of the most democratic forms of popular culture. Right, the fans are the ones who become the readers, and who are the ones who become the writers. The fans are the one who become critics as well. And some of the most insightful work produced in this field has been produced by some of the fans as well. Right, so we put this together because we thought, okay, it's been about the third wave has been in existence for over a decade. There wasn't something that really delineated the field, right? So when we put this together, we thought, what do we want to, what do we want a graduate student or somebody, an undergraduate student to understand about this genre? And first of all, we wanted them to understand that nationalism and national traditions make a difference. Right, and the conditions of publishing, the historical conditions of publishing make a difference as well. So we began with national traditions, the way in which it developed in Britain, the evolution of the American romance novel, and then Australian scholarship has been very much to the fore in terms of romance scholarship. So there is a very strong national tradition as well. So we began with national traditions to see, well, how do you explore it from a national point of view? Then we looked at the major subgenres within the romance, right? So there's the Gothic romance, the historical romance, paranormal and urban fantasy, young adult romance, inspirational or religious romance, erotic romance, African-American romance, and what's people call the desert passion industry. So that was my first book, right? Desert passions, Orientalism, and romance novels, because there's just so much of it. So that's another way, I guess, of looking at it in terms of genres, studying it in terms of its subgenres. Then there are methodological approaches to this as well. So there are media approaches. So so my co-editor Jayashri Kamble, what really interests her about the romance genre is that so much of the discourse about it doesn't actually engage with the text, but engages with the representation of romance in media, right? So she wrote about that. There are literary approaches as well. There are author studies, social sciences as well, the way in which it's used sociologically. And then another big field was also publishing, because it's very commercial. So this is a genre where the publishing conditions make a big difference in the type of romance that is being produced, right? And then another type of scholarship on the romance novel is library studies. So there's been a lot of work done in terms of library collections and romance, particularly because it's the kind of thing that a lot of libraries did not want to collect, or if they collected because their readers, their subscribers demanded it, they didn't catalog it properly because it was just a romance. And then, and then we thought, okay, what are the major themes that we want to explore? The themes that have been explored over the last decade, and where do we want to take this in future as well? So the first thing that we had to look at, of course, was class, right? Class and wealth in popular romance fiction, because from Pamela onwards, from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice onwards, class has been a big element about romance. How much money do you need to have a happy ending, right? So and so much of the scholarship that came out of Britain during the 80s and the 90s was very Marxist feminist, of course. In more recent times, in the 21st century, sex and sexuality, gender and sexuality have been big themes in the romance as well. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff being done on, I guess, representations of gender and sexuality in romance at the moment. I wrote a chapter on love and romance novels as well, because, I'm interested in critical love studies. Then we had romance as a religion, the way in which, so this fits into sociological studies of the culture of romantic love, right? In Britain and America, there's been a lot of work done, particularly in the American space. And then, and the volume basically ends with future directions, or where we are at now, the current obsessions of the field, which are the debates around race, ethnicity, and whiteness, and then also the ways in which I guess in the second half of the 20th century, Harlequin, Mills, and Boon dominated the romance market. This, this dominance was sort of challenged and broken in the 80s with American publishing houses, producing lots and lots of romance. But I think what's really interesting in the 21st century is the way in which, when you look at the emerging publication, houses, and also the emerging markets for romance, it's not the US or Australia, it's not the Anglophone world, it's not really even the Western world anymore. It's really, it's in Nigeria, for example, right? So Nigeria has a really flourishing indigenous romance market, and they're doing very, very interesting things with indigenous forms of romance, which have, piggybacked off the Harlequin model, but then, again, Nigerian authors have found it a very useful vehicle for exploring topics and issues that are relevant to their own culture, particularly for women to have a voice. India is another big market. The Philippines is also another big market. Indonesia and Malaysia developing, there's a developing market in terms of Muslim romances as well. And how does this work within different cultural traditions? So that's basically where the volume ends, looking at, I guess, emerging markets of romance.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I love the scope of this volume. I think that's one of its real benefits, that it's just such an expansive piece. I was wondering if you could, I'm interested, as you know, in historical romance, and I was wondering if you could comment on African-American romance and history, and how, I mean, more broadly, I suppose, how romance fiction can be a kind of means of thinking about different histories, especially women's histories. And I know this is something that you're working on now as well.
Yes, yes. So, this is one of my favorite, I guess, topics, you know, in terms of romance, the stuff which has been done on African-American romance, and the way in which, you know, the African-American historical romance democratized American history, and I guess released it back into the hands of its community. So, and this is a very, it is a very, very racist history of American publishing, right? Because the romance industry, you know, in America, North America, it's like 1.5 billion, between 1.3 to 1.5 billion, you know, dollars in sales every year. Right, so it is huge, but for the most part, it's been dominated by white authors, even though African Americans, you know, are what, 25% of the population. And then in terms of the market share of romance, you know, they are very, very significant as well. But African American authors found it really, really hard to get published by the major publishing houses. And then when they got published, you know, it was by specialist houses that just marketed them as Black romance. You know, and in some ways that was good, because that was, you know, because you could find or locate the market easily. But it was also, you know, disadvantages to Black authors, because what it meant was that in a bookshop, you know, especially you go to a big American chain bookstore or something like that, and then you've got all the different sections of, you know, literary fiction, you know, crime fiction, and then you've got the romance section. And you don't find, until recently, African-American authors listed under romance, because they're sectioned off in Black American fiction, right? So they lose out on that. And so there were, you know, so the story of African-American authors trying to break into the romance market is definitely a story of the structural disadvantages of racism. But one of the things, I guess, one of the first authors who went, you know, who broke this pattern and then became incredibly successful on her own right, in her own right, is a woman called Beverly Jenkins. And Beverly Jenkins is what she calls a kitchen table historian, right? So she was really interested in, I guess, particularly in 19th century Black American history. And she wrote this series of novels, of historical fiction set during, you know, the Civil War, the postbellum period as well. And she touched on slavery. She touched on, you know, African Americans, I guess, in 19th century American historical life, right? And she went and did the research, and you know, and incorporated this into her novels. And what she realized, as you know, as she started selling her books, and when she went to book signings and all of that, was two things. You know, she said two things happened. First of all, when she went to book signings, all of these African American women, you know, these beautiful Black American women would come up to her, and they would be crying. And they would be crying because they said, we were never seen as beautiful enough to feature as the main protagonist in a romance novel. And this is what you've done for us. You know, you've made us normal. You've made us the natural protagonists of a romance novel. And one of the issues about the romance narrative that I am particularly interested is the way in which the genre actually acts as gatekeepers, guardianships of national belonging. Who belongs to the nation? You know, whose stories do we want to read about in terms of, you know, of getting married, having families, all of that kind of stuff. That traditionally, from the 19th century, you know, to the mid 20th century, those ideas of whose loves are worth reading about, those are national questions. They're questions about national belonging. And so this is what her I guess her readers were saying to her that for the first time, Black American women are seen to be worthy of being the main protagonists of romance novels, which is, which I just found the saddest thing when, when I first came across it. So that was one thing. But the other thing that they were saying to her was that, they didn't know so much, how much African Americans had not just contributed, but had made American history, because they weren't taught that at school, right? So that Jenkins's novels ended up being a sort of alternative history that put Black Americans back into the national picture. And she recentered historical narratives around the Black community, right? Focused on the Black middle class, focused on agency, on Black agency, so that they weren't just the victims of oppression, and they weren't just slaves and all of that. She uncovered stories about doctors, about middle class Black people who got involved politically. Now the historians were doing that, but most of her readers were not reading historians' works. They were reading her works. So then what she used to do then, when her first few books came out, was then to run these tours. Oh, we thought this wasn't going to happen, but we're in nostalgia and gloom again.
Yeah, we came in here specifically so the lights wouldn't go off. So
and
that
worked
well.
Yeah. But anyway, but she ended up running history tours based on her books to the slave museum in Savannah, Georgia, right? To all of these places, and so that so she used her romance novels then as a way of restoring to the Black American community their own history. So I thought like that was one of the most interesting things. I mean, for me, she's a really, really interesting novelist because she works on so many levels as a historian, public historian, I guess, in terms of revolutionizing the romance industry. She was the first one, first Black American author who made it big in the romance industry, and then also in terms of her activism as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. I wanted to turn to your chapter in this book, which is on love in the romance novel. And I was wondering if you might give an indication of what love means now in the romance novel and what love has meant in the romance novel, because as we know, love has a history, right? So I was wondering if you might comment on that.
Gee, I wish I reread my chapter.
Sorry, I didn't want that question was coming.
Okay, look, I'm really interested, I guess, in the discourses around love, not because I think that it doesn't exist or anything like that, but because I think everybody feels the emotion, but there is the cluster of ideas around it, the cluster of beliefs and value systems around it that puts it firmly for me in the realm of cultural history, right? So I think in this chapter on love and romance novels, basically I'm beginning with what does love mean in the 19th century? When you read a Jane Austen novel, what does love mean there? And and it's quite, I think it's there are in some ways it's almost an inversion of the things that we take for granted now in terms of our understandings of love. So in the 19th century, for example, when you're reading all of these novels, but also when you're reading love letters, which is other work that I've done, there's a lot of emphasis on it's a middle class version of love, because the traces that we have are middle class, of course, right? If you look at at other traces of love, like convict tokens and all of that, right? That yields a different type of data. But when we're looking at fiction, we're looking at middle class ideas of love, which emphasize character, which emphasize, shared, shared values, particularly shared religious values. It's not that you have to be super religious or anything like that, but there has to be, a convergence of ideas around religiosity and those fundamental values. there is also, which I think is really interesting considering what we think about love now, there's also a suspicion of passion and a suspicion of emotion, of hyper emotion, right? Because those emotions are it's about infatuation. It doesn't last. It's not a good stable basis for marriage and all of that. So that's, I guess, that characterizes a lot of love in the 19th century. And, when we look at a lot of the 19th century texts, the other thing also is that, that they think money is really important as well, right? Because you can't have successful love relationships and you can't have a happy ending without a certain measure of affluence as well. Right. So
Darcy has to have his Pemberley.
Darcy has to have his Pemberley. Elizabeth, falls in love with Darcy when she sees Pemberley. Yeah,
she is.
Yes. So, anyway, and I think towards the late 19th, early 20th century, ideas about intimacy, right, and understanding, trying to bring the genders together, that you can see that in the romance novel. And in the early 20th century, there's a lot of discourse around love. What is love? There are all of these, they're quite funny actually, but very, very long-winded, high, lofty, descriptive passages about, to me, love means blah, 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 and so there's a lot of writing, a lot of discourse around love. Now that pretty much dies out by the mid 20th century. By the late 20th century, I think there isn't that exploration or that trying to tease out ideas around love anymore, because people just take it for granted. This is what love is, right? And then far from the 19th century suspicion about passion, about feeling emotion and all of that, now it's like it's in his kiss, right? Yeah. You know that you're in love because you feel it, because it's, so Jodi McAllister talks about compulsory demisexuality, and it's like the guy that you are really sexually attracted to, that's the one that is your one true love. So it's almost an inversion of the early 19th century, right? Because if you think about Pride and Prejudice, who is the guy that Elizabeth Bennet is attracted to? It's Wickham, and he's the villain. Right, but now he would be the hero. So there's an inversion there in terms of ideas about love. But in this chapter, I'm also really interested in what happens to writers who push the boundaries of the romance form and try and carry love to its ultimate conclusion. And so, as you know, I love Jennifer Crusie, yes, because I find her a very, very interesting romance writer. And she is one of the first to look at, to investigate stalking, middle age, she pushes the boundaries of the romance in many ways. But I think, one of the things that she comes to in the end, she stopped writing, and why she stopped writing interests me, because, if I follow her corpus of work, it's like conventional romance, and then she starts to push the boundaries, and then she gets more, more metafictional, because she, she's a scholar as well. I think she did her master's or a PhD, right? And then, so she knows a lot, and then Bet Me, her novel incorporates a lot of romance scholarship into the novel as well. But she gets to a certain point where she understands the history of love. She understands the trajectory of romance, and she's putting it all into this very metafictional novel, Bet Me. And then she's looking at okay, love is not just about sexual attraction. It's not just about about the passion or something like that. She understands that from the 1980s onwards, David Shumway, so many people are talking about intimacy. So in her later novels, she moves from passion to intimacy, right? So romantic love is not just passion anymore. Now we're in the age of intimacy. And then she moves into the age of intimacy. And then she starts to, by one of her last novels, Fast Women, she starts to wonder what happens when you get to the end of intimacy, or what happens after the happily ever after as you grow, and if you start to grow apart. right? Is intimacy the answer then? And she doesn't have an answer to that. And pretty much after that, when she can't solve this conundrum of what love is anymore, or how you maintain relationships, she pretty much stops writing romance novels.
That's unusually depressing for romance, which is, as we know, the happy genre. I was wondering if you could comment on, you sort of touched on this earlier, but I was wondering if you could sort of expand on some of the issues that are really popular in romance scholarship, or where you think the scholarship is headed now. For example, we're just having a conversation before we started here about queer romance, for example.
Yeah. So we had this conversation about queer romance because I just did this PACE project with some PACE students, and they got to read young adult fiction, and they read a couple of books, and I didn't tell them anything about romance, but three of them, then said, oh, they read these novels, and then and they realized that that there was this queer romance going through. And then, and then they realized that the fundamental importance of the romance genre was that it normalized relations, and it made it possible to have happy endings, right? And that was why it's so important. Now, this is something that romance scholars realized earlier on. So Jennifer Cruzy, again, when she's talking about if you have a look at the long history of literary fiction with romantic narratives in them, right, that end unhappily, it's like, woman has sex outside of marriage,
immediately dead,
right? And one of the wonderful things about romance novels for Jennifer Cruzy is that women get to have sex and they don't die at the end of the novel, right? And that's one of the things that that the PACE students that I was working with suddenly realized about the romance genre as well, and why it's so important for for LGBTQIA people, that you can tell all of these stories and have a positive, hopeful, happy ending that brings them right into into the heart of society, and that says to them, you belong at the center of this narrative, which is why I say it's a narrative about national belonging as well.
And emancipatory in ways that perhaps it doesn't get credit for, I think. Yeah. It's about 22. So Bridget, I know you wanted to start questions, so I'm right on time.
Thanks for that, Steph. So I can see Tom's got his hand up, and just to let you know, Steph, I'll keep an eye on the chat for any questions.
Yeah, I can't see it from where I am.
Sure. That's fine, I understand. So we might start with with Tom.
Thanks, Bridget. Thank you, Hsu-Ming. Thank you, Steph, for this wonderful talk. I, over the last few days, voraciously read as many chapters of this edited collection as I can, as a fellow, journeyman on the road to trash studies, I guess.
And Trash Collective, I believe I called it.
I think so. So I just wanted to first of all say congrats, Hsu-Ming, for having put together this fantastic collection with many scholars whose works I have also been engaging with here and there. I especially, of course, enjoyed those final comments you said about those PACE students, because it resonates so very strongly with my own work on the role of popular culture in East and Southeast Asia, on presenting emancipatory discourses of romance and sex and queerness in many different ways, which I think maybe brings me to the question around, if we think about romance studies, and I'm sure you share this concern with me as well, and this isn't a critique of the collection, but it is extremely Anglo-centric. And I sit there being very well aware of, for instance, the huge publishing booms in Japan, Jamsai Publishing in Thailand, doing similar sorts of work, but taking their inspiration not from the Harlequin, but from the Japanese side. Precious Pages in the Philippines, where Wattpad novels are transformed into real, tangible books, and then a stable of authors are brought in to create Anglophone and Tagalog and Taglish fiction in the Philippine context. So I wonder what you're feeling, because there's only that one chapter at the end that talks about, the global. And I wonder what your reflections are as someone in this field would be about the potentials of romance studies from a perhaps less Eurocentric, Western-centric perspective?
Oh, look, I completely agree with you, right? The issue was about trying to recruit those authors to try and contribute to this volume. And we just couldn't, because they didn't feel that their work was at a sufficient stage where they, they were prepared to contribute a chapter. And also they didn't feel that the scholarship was sufficiently developed at that time. This thing has been it's longer than, the gestation of an elephant. It was like we started working on this. When did we start? I think 2017 or something like that. It's been really, really long. So yeah, so basically that was it. And so we said to Katrina, Darwin, look, because we wanted her to write about Muslim romances and all of that. We wanted a whole lot of other stuff as well, and it wasn't possible. So short answer is we need a follow-up volume. And Tom, I'm inviting you to be my co-editor. Not that I'm editing anything again. Yeah.
Okay, Steph, I think perhaps Veronica's next, and then I'll read out a question in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for that, Hsu-Ming. I'm thinking about what you said about how in a way, the form, the plot of the romance is the most predictable or at least interesting part of it. And I was just thinking of a kind of a snarky dismissal of Jane Austen that perhaps many of us have seen. It was something like, male lead, I love female lead, she must never find out. Female lead, I love male lead, he must never find out, they find out, the end. So in a way, yeah, the end is in the beginning in a way. But is there a sense in which this is it can teach students to read? Because I've often found that when I teach novels rather than poetry, which is my normal mode, but when I teach novels, I have to push against the instinct to just read for the plot and say, well, this plot twist surprised me, or I didn't like this character, to get students to look beyond the plot. So is there a way in which it's a kind of a perfect pedagogical tool because we're immediately looking beyond the plot?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say, I'm not saying that that the plot is not important, because I think the plot is very, very important. All genre fiction is plot driven, right? So the plot is important. What I was saying is that if you're analyzing it for language, right, the use of language, it's probably not as rewarding, right? Yeah. So, but beyond that, Jane Austen as expert, you should respond here as well.
I teach romance quite a bit in at the undergraduate level in both of my units, and I would say that romance is extremely good at teaching students to read genre fiction, because it enables them to understand, I think, even more starkly than other genres, that the formula is the point. The formula isn't boring, it's what you do with the formula. So instead of them saying, well, we know what's going to happen, two people meet, end up, there'll be complications, and they'll get together at the end. They learn that there's an infinite variety of ways to get there, and an infinite variety of things that it can actually be about. So I think it's very, whenever I teach genre, I start with romance, because I think it's the easiest way for them to see how genre fiction works. And from there, once they get it, they can understand almost any genre and understand the point of genre in a much clearer way, because it is, I think, the starkest example of how genre works and why the formula is actually interesting and not boring, even though it ends up in the same place.
Yeah. And I often say, Veronica, that it's like a game of chess. You know that the end point is checkmate, but it's about how you get there.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, just quickly, not to say that I think that the plot is boring or unimportant, but just that it's something that we have to figure out how it's being pushed back against, resisted, complicated, or not allowed to focus solely on it as the one thing we get out. But yeah, not trying to be dismissive of the plotting at all. Thank you for that answer.
Thanks, Veronica. Now we have a question from Iqbal, seconded by Joanne. What's the impact of Amazon self-publishing on the form of the romance novel?
Okay, so John Market has done quite a bit of work on self-publishing, right? And so he's got a chapter in this volume as well. So he's the publishing guru. And he says, you know, in one ways, it has, what it's done, which has been quite exciting, is that it showed, I guess, the big 5 publishers that there were all of these niche markets that were neglected. Right. And so it enabled a lot of people to write things and to break into the market. You know, I mean, I think virtually all of the genres or the subgenres that have pushed the boundaries of the romance have come out in the digital space first. And so, you know, so digital has been, so Amazon has been very useful for that. Having said that, though, there's only a handful of romance authors who first publish on Amazon who then make it on to become, you know, big name authors, right? So, you know, it certainly can be done, but most of them stay within, I guess, the Amazon space, and then and the reach is not as great. Another thing that I guess I've noticed recently is that you know, if I look at Amazon sales over the last 10, 20 years, I'd say that that probably you can see that what used to be mainstream romances used to dominate Amazon, but when you search for romance now in terms of the algorithms, probably you see a lot more erotic content in the Amazon space, and that you know, so the erotic or what I guess would have before have become, you know, I think John calls it erotic, right? It's X-rated erotica. You know, I can see Tom is getting very excited here. Sorry, Tom, but you know, but that's dominating the Amazon market space when, you know, when you Google, I guess when you search for romance now. There are also other studies that show that, you know, that independent authors or authors who publish independently are most successful when, like, for example, like Courtney Milan, they begin with a big publisher and then, you know, they get a following and then they take themselves out and then go independent. To do it the other way around requires a lot of effort. I met an independent romance author once, and the amount of work she put into, you know, social media, Facebook, reaching out to all her readers every day, it was just exhausting. I mean, she worked really hard just to maintain that market. Yeah. So I don't know whether that answers that question.
Thanks, Hsu-Ming. I think I'll move on to Ian's question. How has the romance novel responded to the world of Grindr and Tinder?
Oh, okay. So, so I guess the world of Grindr and Tinder are now part of the Cute Meat plot, right? So, you know, they're the way in which I guess, you know, one of the things that that Catherine Roach says about the romance in her book Happily Ever After, where she argues for a reparative reading of the romance, is you know, is that the romance is very sex positive, particularly for women, and also for all kinds of I guess, you know, different genders as well, and so I guess that, you know, there is a romanticization, obviously, of that kind of world, right? That it's incorporated into the romance, and then you know, and then authors make fun of it in you know, in all kinds of very overt ways. I remember reading something quite you know, earlier this year. Someone was asking me to review something, and and who was it by? It was by this Black American author called Whitney G, and she wrote this she wrote this this book, this romance, and I think and she specializes in what she calls alpha hole heroes, right? So they're quite unpleasant and they are transformed in the course of romance, which is what happens. It's one of the conventions of the romance. But he had developed an app, you know, called Cinder. And the, you know, so the CEO of Tinder was suing this guy who had developed Cinder and had basically plagiarized and ripped him off. So, you know, so it's brought into, I guess, into the world of romance in quite tongue-in-cheek ways as well.
Thanks, Hsu-Ming. A question from Hilary. Is there research being done into the influence of TikTok and bookstagram on the popularity of romance? You were talking about audiences earlier, and there's such a demand for romance on BookTok.
Okay, I wouldn't know because as everybody here knows, like I'm completely hopeless with social media. So I'm sure there is because, because, there's so much being done out there, right? Particularly by graduate students in the US. I'm sure somebody's doing a research project on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tom, do you want to add something quickly there?
Oh, I just know that there's people who are looking at this from the perspective of social media studies. There's a research collective out of Curtin University on TikTok, headed by Crystal Abaddon, who's a real big mover and shaker in media, social media studies. And at their recent conference, someone did a talk, not necessarily on romance, but just on the broader BookTok phenomenon. And a lot of that's driven by genre fiction. So it is something that's, I think, probably emerging soon. They were talking about fantasy, but yeah, romance as well, I think would be something that would emerge quickly.
Steph, I wonder if it would be okay if I asked a question.
Of course.
Which is, Hsu-Ming, in that presentation, you did reflect along the way on how you approach this book and the different sort of sections and interests within it on national traditions, themes, subgenres, etc. I wondered how you and your co-editors divided up the work. And secondly, were there any moments when you were editing the book and the chapters you were particularly focused on when you were surprised by what you were reading or what you were learning?
Oh, okay, so how do we do this? All right, because it was, I think all of us looked through all of the chapters. Right. So the only work that we probably divided up was the introduction, because we were co-writing it, and then we sort of realized that, it's going to be a lot easier and will get done more quickly if we just section that. But for the rest of it, all chapters were reviewed by all of us. Yeah, and the chapter that most surprised, I guess, was the last one by Katrina Dowd, where she looks at the different forms, like global forms of romance and all of that. The stuff on Nigerian romance was really, really interesting. I know there's a lot more being done, in that space now, I mean, I feel in many ways, that this was great, but I feel like it's already outdated in some ways because the field moves on so quickly. Right, so I feel like that's why there needs to be follow-up volumes, the one I'm going to do with Tom, but there's also another, at the moment I'm co-editing another volume on historical romances called Revising the Past, Repurposing History, and it's about reparative readings of history through the historical romance, and so my work there intersects very much with Steph's work on historical anachronism, and Steph is also covering historical romance as well. Yeah, but yeah, those are probably the things that most surprise, I guess.
Thanks, Hsu-Ming. I think we've got a question from Karen.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful event. It's great to hear about this this work. I'm really interested in women and work and ideas about women and work and domestic work, emotional labor, things like that. I'm wondering if any of this is, any discourse about this is finding its way into romance novels, and if not, what are the big kind of sociological questions that are starting to appear a lot at this moment in romance?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, work is one of the most, I guess, most important topics in the romance novel since the early 20th century. So even something as conservative, as Mills and Boon tended to be really conservative because they had the biggest market share, right? They were global, it spanned the British Empire to begin with. And then, after they got the deal with Harlequin in terms of paperback distributions in North America, that, increased their market hugely. But the bigger the market was, the more conservative they became, because they didn't want to, they didn't want to annoy certain markets. So, for example, Joseph McCallier talks about this in his History of Mills and Boon. In the 60s, Mills and Boon had some writers who were trying to push the civil rights agenda. And the editors of Mills and Boon just kept pulling them back, because they kept saying, we don't want to annoy the Southern American market, and we don't want to annoy the South African market as well. Right, so that's why Mills and Boon tended to be a very retarding conservative force on the evolution of romance. And when, that's why I say when the digital space opened up and self-publishing became possible, I guess the radical potentials of the genre took off in so many ways, because they weren't concerned with big markets anymore. They were just concerned with reaching out to their niche markets. I've forgotten the rest of your question, Karen, sorry.
No, you answered it. It was just really about whether work is a subject that finds its way in.
Yeah. So even in Mills and Boon, work was always really important, and work was central, and the conditions of work as well. And I think one of the really interesting things that you can trace in even in the conservative Mills and Boon was the issue of childcare. Right. How are women going to have careers if they're going to, if they're going to have to balance that with childcare? And you see that particularly in the Mills and Boon and Harlequin books coming out particularly in the 1980s as well. And then, of course, by the time you get to chick lit is really, one American scholar calls it labor lit, because it's all about the professional woman, and it's all about the conditions of work and overwork, right? Within the urban space, yeah. So it is absolutely crucial, as I said, to the romance genre.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Hsu-Ming and Karen. Quick last question from Tai.
Sure. Thanks for a great presentation, Hsu-Ming. The question that Karen asked is probably the type of question I would usually ask. And so I'd like your response to that. But I was really interested when you were talking about love and intimacy, and wanted to pose a question about how we might think about that across such a large department. Obviously, romance research and literature is kind of a forerunner in understanding a lot of these kind of topics that are now super important about affect and media studies and cultural studies and elsewhere. Is there something that you think we can take away, those of us who aren't researching romance literature, in terms of how we might approach those kind of questions about intimacy, love, affect?
I think there's a lot of work being done by the Love Studies Network in the UK on critical love studies, right? So that's Michael Gratzky's group, and he basically says that love is what you think it is. But there is such a big, there's such a big body of work on love now, and I think that the scholarship on love has shifted from the philosophical, explanation of this is what love is, right, to the literary scholars who said, oh, this is what love is in books, and therefore it must be a representation of what love is in society at that time. To now, we are at a point where it's like, okay, there are different competing ideas about what love means in society at any particular point of time, and it differs according to different cultural contexts as well. Right. So Lin Pan, for example, one of the most exciting books that I read on this subject was Lin Pan's book on When True Love Came to China, and she looked at the way in which discourses of European romantic love came to China with the missionaries and with on the backs like with the books that that the colonizers brought with them, right? And then the way in which ideas of the of the Xinhua Revolution of 1911 were formulated and articulated through Western discourses of romantic love that put gender relations at the heart of what a non-imperial, post-imperial Chinese republic might look like, And then the way it was such a puzzle to them as well, because because there was this strong emphasis on filiality in Chinese culture, but not necessarily on romance, and also because I guess Western discourses of romantic love had at its heart that whole, I guess, Greco-Christian split between mind, body, soul, body as well, in a way that is not true for other non-Western cultures, right? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff being done in terms of discourses there. But I guess, I don't know, for me, and maybe this is just, my midlife crisis as an academic. I feel like I spent, so much of my earlier, career critiquing, and looking at all the things that were wrong with travel writing, post-colonial, all of those kinds of stuff. And it's not that I don't think that they're not important anymore, but I guess like now, I think, okay, they are really, really important. We need to know about and critique all of those kinds of things. But I also feel like, what Sedgwick says about reparative reading, and reading for hope and optimism and all the things that are going right, that becomes increasingly important to me, in the midst of my midlife crisis, right? So, and I think that, that is something that maybe we don't do enough of as scholars in all different disciplines. So I don't know whether that answers your question, Ty.
Yeah, we all need a bit of optimism. That's it.
I think that's an excellent place to end this. I'm sorry, but I am mindful of time. So look, I'd like to suggest that everyone who can unmute themselves, and we give a round of applause to Hsu-Ming and Steph for a wonderful conversation in week 13. I would like, and congratulations are also on the book coming in the chat. I'd also like to thank all of you who've attended. 48 people in week 13 is a terrific turnout. And I'm also really pleased that we've ended this series with some matchmaking. So Hsu-Ming has found herself a new co-editor in Tom. So we look forward to hearing about that collaboration in due course. I'm going